The sun was setting behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the war-torn valley where the unit had finally stopped moving. Smoke still curled from the edges of the village they'd secured only hours earlier, and the air hung heavy with silence, the kind of silence that came only after chaos. Sergeant Daniel Rourke sat on a broken step at the edge of the destroyed schoolhouse, his rifle across his knees, eyes blank, boots caked in dust and dried mud. The blood on his uniform wasn't his. It belonged to Corporal Mason Hale, the youngest in their squad, the one who used to hum old songs during patrols, who carried pictures of his son folded in his helmet lining, and who had always said he didn't believe in luck but carried a chipped toy car in his pocket anyway. Mason had died that morning. A shell had dropped 3 buildings down, and the concussion had taken him mid-step, mid-joke, mid-life. No one had expected it. No one had time to save him. By the time Rourke reached him, he was already gone, eyes open, expression calm, almost peaceful. Too peaceful. That's what haunted Rourke the most. Now, hours later, when the noise had faded and the radios had quieted, Rourke sat alone with Mason's personal effects spread out before him on a tarp. He was tasked with collecting them for inventory, for the military archive, for some distant box that would eventually be mailed home. Dog tags, a photograph, a small Bible, the toy car. And then, folded carefully in a side pocket of Mason's vest, Rourke found the letter. It wasn't in an envelope. It was worn at the edges, the creases soft from being opened and closed so many times. The handwriting was Mason's, neat, careful, uneven in places where the ink had smeared. Rourke didn't mean to read it, but his eyes caught the first line, and then he couldn't stop. "Dear Lucas," it began, "I hope your birthday was perfect. I'm sorry I missed it again this year. I promise when I get home, we'll have 2 cakes, and I'll take you fishing like I used to. Remember the last time you caught that big one and I dropped it back in? Your mum still teases me about it. She's probably reading this to you right now, and if she is, I want you both to know how much I love you." The letter went on, filled with small stories, apologies, hope. There was no mention of war, no mention of danger, just warmth, just a father trying to hold on to his place in a little boy's heart. By the end, Rourke realized the letter had never been sent. Mason had probably meant to mail it after the mission. Or maybe he couldn't bring himself to let it go. Whatever the reason, it was here now, unread, undelivered, forgotten. Rourke sat with it for a long time, the paper trembling in his hands as night crept in around him. He thought of the medals Mason would never wear, the birthdays he'd miss, the cake that would never be baked. And then, quietly, without telling anyone, he made a decision. He folded the letter back along the same creases, slid it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and zipped it shut. It didn't belong in a box. It didn't belong on a shelf. It belonged in the hands of the boy it was written for. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But if there was anything left in this broken world worth doing, it was that. The following day, the unit moved out. No one asked about the extra weight in Rourke's chest. No one noticed the change in his silence. But every time he tightened the straps on his vest, he felt the shape of the folded paper against his heart. The war continued. Weeks blurred into months. Missions came and went. But the letter stayed with him, through gunfire, through sandstorms, through endless nights where sleep came only in broken fragments. He kept it dry during monsoons, guarded it during firefights, pulled it out in the quiet moments when everything else felt too much. It became more than a letter. It became a reason. When his tour finally ended and the plane touched down on the home soil, the air smelled different, cleaner, quieter, but strange. He didn't go straight home. He filed the report, turned in his weapon, signed the papers. Then he rented a car, pulled out a crumpled note from Mason's old gear that had an address scribbled in the corner. It was in a small town in Nebraska, 3 turns off a state highway near fields that stretched for miles. The house was modest, a white porch, a mailbox shaped like a dog. He parked across the street and sat for a long time. He had no idea what he was going to say. How do you tell a boy that the letter his father wrote was meant for him, but never got there in time? How do you deliver something that now carries the weight of finality? Rourke stepped out of the car and crossed the street. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a jacket and boots still scuffed with foreign dirt. He knocked once, then again. A woman opened the door. She looked tired, but kind. There was a moment of silence as she studied him, unsure. Then Rourke spoke, voice low and steady. "My name is Daniel Rourke. I served with your husband." Her hand rose to her mouth. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the letter, now sealed in a fresh envelope, and held it out. "He wanted your son to have this." She took it with shaking fingers, and behind her, standing in the hallway, holding a toy car in one hand, was a boy, no older than 7. Lucas, looking at Rourke with the same eyes his father once had. Eyes full of questions, eyes full of quiet, waiting hope. The moment the envelope passed from Rourke's hand to hers, something shifted, like time slowed down in the doorway of that small Nebraska home. The kind of quiet shift that meant nothing on the surface, but everything underneath. Mason's wife, Elena, held the letter to her chest as if afraid it might slip away again, and Rourke stood frozen, his fingers still hovering where paper had been. Behind her, the boy with the toy car took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Rourke's face, not with fear, but with that deep, wordless curiosity only children seem to possess, as if sensing there was something important just beneath the surface. Eleanor turned after a long moment and nodded gently, stepping aside to let him in without a word, as if they both knew speaking too soon would break whatever fragile thing they were sharing. The inside of the house was small but warm, lived in, filled with the presence of someone now missing. The smell of old wood and laundry detergent, a pair of boots by the door, photos lining the walls in mismatched frames, some dusty, some recent. Rourke's eyes scanned them without meaning to. Wedding day smiles, a toddler in a high chair, Mason in uniform holding a newborn in a hospital room, and each one hit like a quiet punch to the chest. He sat when offered, awkwardly, perching on the edge of the couch, while Lucas climbed onto an armchair across from him and continued to clutch the toy car, rubbing his thumb across its chipped roof like it was a ritual. Eleanor sat down slowly and finally spoke. "He used to write every week. He never told me what was in the letters to Lucas, said it was their thing. But after he—" She paused, swallowed, and blinked twice. "After we got the call, I looked everywhere. There was nothing. I thought maybe it got lost." Rourke nodded once. It didn't. He carried it with him. And then, carefully, he told them what Mason had been like in those final weeks. Not the soldier Mason, but the man. The jokes he cracked, the songs he hummed, how he always talked about his kid like he was the smartest, funniest person on earth. He didn't talk about the way Mason died, just the way he lived. Eleanor listened, silent but alert, tears sliding slowly down her cheeks. Lucas leaned forward, the toy car forgotten in his lap, eyes wide. When Rourke finally finished, no one moved for a while. Then Elena stood and said she was going to read the letter to Lucas later when he was ready. Rourke stood too, assuming that was his cue to leave, but as he walked toward the door, Lucas suddenly spoke. "Did he ever talk about fishing?" Rourke stopped, turned. "All the time." Lucas smiled, just a little. "He said I caught a fish once, but he dropped it." Rourke laughed, the first real sound to escape him since stepping into the house. That story got retold at least a dozen times. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You hungry?" she asked. "I made too much soup." And so he stayed. For dinner. Then for coffee. Then for one more story. The next day he found himself still in town. He hadn't planned to stay, but something pulled at him, something that told him this part of his duty wasn't done yet. He checked into a motel, a quiet place off the highway with flickering neon and a grumpy clerk who didn't ask questions. Over the next few days, he visited the house again, and again. He brought an old photo he had of Mason and the squad. He helped Elena with a leaky sink. He taught Lucas how to toss a baseball. He didn't mean to insert himself into their lives. It just happened naturally, like gravity. One afternoon, while they were out in the backyard with a cheap fishing rod in a kiddie pool full of rubber ducks, Lucas suddenly said, "You're not like the other soldiers." Rourke blinked. "Why's that?" "Because you came back." That silence again, the one that wasn't empty, but full of things no one could say. Rourke felt the weight of the war pressing down in his chest like it always did, but this time it mixed with something else. Warmth, maybe, or ache, or just the unfamiliar shape of healing. That night, Eleanor handed him a box. "These were Masons. I think you should have them." Inside were small things: a journal, a few maps, a folding knife, and a patch with their unit's insignia. Rourke ran his fingers over the stitching and closed his eyes. "He'd want you to keep them," he said softly. But Elena shook her head. "He'd want you to remember him right. And I think you do." Rourke didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling of the motel room until sunrise, thinking about promises, about how some things followed you long after the fighting ended. The next morning, Lucas knocked on his door. "Can we go to the lake today?" Rourke blinked at him in surprise. "Your mom okay with that?" Lucas grinned. "She packed sandwiches." At the lake, the water was still and glassy, the sun bright but not hot. They didn't catch anything. But Rourke let Lucas steer the boat in slow, awkward circles, and when they returned to shore, the boy turned to him and asked the question that had been hanging in the air for days. "Are you going to stay?" Rourke didn't answer right away. He looked at the shoreline, the trees, the gentle waves, and then at the boy, his best friend's son, holding a toy car in one hand and a fishing pole in the other. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'm not leaving just yet." And maybe, for now, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the motel room that had once felt like a temporary stopover began to take on the weight of something closer to shelter, a place not quite home but not foreign either, a middle space where Rourke could breathe without armor and think without flinching. Every morning he woke up before the alarm, sat on the edge of the bed with his boots unlaced and hands resting on his knees, staring at the same crack in the ceiling, wondering how he had ended up here and somehow knowing it was exactly where he needed to be. He spent more time with Lucas, their daily rhythm becoming something gentle and familiar. School drop-offs, fishing practice, trips to the hardware store where Lucas insisted on pushing the cart and always asked for the same root beer. He helped Elena around the house without being asked, fixing a squeaky door hinge, repairing a section of the fence, changing the oil in her car, and when she tried to thank him, he'd only shrug and say, "It's what Mason would have done." At night, after Lucas had gone to bed, they sat on the porch sometimes, the kind of silence between them that didn't demand conversation, just presence. Rourke told her things he'd never told anyone, not even the counselors with their notebooks and understanding eyes, about the day he almost didn't make it home, about the weight of carrying letters from fallen men, about how he'd memorized the sound of Mason's laugh because it was the only thing that cut through the gunfire in his memory. Eleanor listened without pity or judgment, just the quiet steadiness of someone who had lost deeply and come out the other side still standing. One night she said, "You don't have to keep proving you deserve to be here. We already know." And he hadn't realized until that moment how much of him had still been waiting for someone to say exactly that. The turning point came one weekend in late spring when the local community held a small memorial service for veterans and fallen soldiers in the town square. Eleanor asked Rourke if he wanted to come, and he said yes before she even finished the question. The event was simple: a few folding chairs, a podium, children holding flags, and old men in faded uniforms saluting with trembling hands. Rourke didn't wear anything to mark himself. No medals, no badges, just jeans and a clean shirt. But when Mason's name was read aloud and Elena squeezed his hand so hard her knuckles went white, he knew he wasn't there as a stranger anymore. Lucas stood beside him, holding that same toy car, now worn smooth with time. After the service, a man from the town approached, an older gentleman with a cane and cloudy eyes, who introduced himself as a retired officer. "You served with Hale?" he asked. Rourke nodded. Yes, sir. He was my closest friend. The man looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and handed Rourke a small worn patch, an insignia from his own unit decades earlier. "Give this to the boy when he's older," he said. "Tell him men like his father never really die." That night, Rourke sat with Lucas on the back porch, the stars scattered like cold embers across the sky, and he told him the story of the patch. He didn't talk about war, he talked about courage, about kindness, about how the strongest people were the ones who kept showing up, even when they were afraid. Lucas nodded and placed the patch in a small tin box beside the toy car and the now framed letter they'd read together just once and then sealed behind glass. The next day, Eleanor asked Rourke if he'd thought about what came next. He hesitated, said he hadn't. But that was only half true. He had thought about it every day. The job offer from the nearby Veteran Support Center was still sitting on his phone, unread, but very real. They needed someone to mentor younger veterans, someone who understood loss and transition, someone who had walked the line and come back. And for the first time in years, Rourke didn't feel like he was pretending to be whole. He felt like someone who could give, not just survive. He accepted the job 2 days later. He found a small apartment just 5 blocks from Elena and Lucas, close enough to visit, far enough to give them space. But more often than not, he found himself back at their place for dinner, or to help with homework, or to play catch in the yard. Slowly, quietly, life began to take shape around him.